Hello. Most of us grew up with a specific image of Zeus, a noble, white-bearded patriarch hurling lightning from a marble throne. But the original texts tell a much darker story. They describe a paranoid, cannibalistic cosmic entity far removed from the sanitized versions on our screens. Today, we often equate the divine with moral order, but in the chaotic brutality of the Bronze Age, the gods were as unpredictable and violent as the storms they commanded. To find the true king of Olympus, he once devoured his first wife whole, just to cure a persistent headache. He transformed into a literal shower of gold to infiltrate a high-security prison. And he only seized his throne after forcing his own father to vomit up 5 fully grown, half-digested siblings. I am just a storyteller, trying to make sense of these old myths. So subscribe if you want to stay for the journey. Also, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Now, take a deep breath. Let the room around you dissolve. We are moving away from the light of the sun and into the cold, silent depths of the beginning. We are going back to the infinite void of chaos. In this hollow silence, the first structures of existence began to take shape. There was no sun to mark the passage of hours, only the heavy, suffocating presence of the primordial. Out of the nothingness emerged Gaia, the deep-breasted earth, the firm foundation of all things. She did not emerge into a world, she was the world. To mirror her vastness, she brought forth Uranus, the starry sky, who wrapped himself around her in a perpetual, crushing embrace. This was the first union, the dawn of the physical universe, but it was not a time of peace. It was a time of weight and confinement. Uranus, fearing the strength of the children he fathered upon Gaia, refused to let them see the light. He forced them back into the dark recesses of her womb, causing the earth herself to groan under the pressure of suppressed life. This is where the great pattern began, a cycle of violence and displacement that would define the cosmos for eons. We call it the succession myth, a brutal law of nature where the son must destroy the father to claim his place. Gaia, weary of her husband's cruelty and the literal weight of her unborn children, fashioned a weapon from the very stone of her being, a sickle of gray flint, sharp and cold. She called to her sons, the Titans, asking who among them would dare to end their father's tyranny. Most trembled, but the youngest, Cronus, felt a spark of ambition that outweighed his fear. When Uranus descended that night to cover the earth, Cronus lay in wait. With a single jagged strike, he castrated his father. The screams of the sky echoed across the void as his power was severed. From that blood, giants and furies were born, and the rule of Uranus came to a jagged, bloody end. Cronus stood atop the ruins of his father's dignity, claiming the title of King of the Universe. This era is often remembered by mortal poets as the Golden Age, a time when the world was young and the seasons did not yet bite with frost. But for those living in the shadow of the peaks, it was an age of absolute terror. Cronus was not a liberator. He was a mirror of the man he had just mutilated. He took his sister Rhea as his queen, but the crown sat heavy on his brow. This prophecy became the rot at the center of his mind. Cronus did not see his children as a legacy. He saw them as rivals, as assassins waiting to be born. He became a prisoner of his own paranoia, watching Rhea's growing belly with the eyes of a wolf. When the first child, Hestia, was born, Rhea presented the infant to her husband, perhaps hoping the sight of his own blood would soften his heart. Instead, Cronus did the unthinkable. He opened his massive jaws and swallowed the infant whole, trapping her within the dark prison of his own stomach. There was no negotiation, no mercy. He was trying to swallow fate itself. Next came Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and she too disappeared down his throat. Then Hera, the future queen, followed by the dark-eyed Hades and the restless Poseidon. One by one, the first generation of the great Olympians was consumed, held in a state of living death within their father's body. They were immortal, so they did not die. They simply existed in a cramped, acidic darkness, listening to the thumping heart of the man who had stolen their lives before they had even begun. By the time the fifth child was swallowed, the universe had settled into a grim equilibrium. There was no rebellion, no hope, and no light on the horizon. The heavens were ruled by a Titan who had turned his own body into a tomb. Cronus believed he had cheated the prophecy. He believed he had finally secured a throne that would last forever, built on a foundation of fear and the consumption of his own kin. But deep within the earth, Gaia was already whispering a different path, and Rhea, broken by the loss of 5 children, was reaching her breaking point. The stage was set for a deception that would change the nature of power forever. Rhea's grief had finally hardened into a cold, calculated resolve. When the labor pains of her 6th pregnancy began, she didn't look to the peaks of Mount Othrys for comfort, but to the ancient limestone shadows of the earth. She fled to the island of Crete, birthing the child in the dark sanctuary of a mountain cave. But she knew that birth was only half the struggle. Survival in the age of Cronus required a magnificent lie. She found a heavy stone, the omphalos, and dressed it in the fine linens and fragrant oils of a newborn infant. When Cronus demanded his prize, she handed him the cold, unyielding weight. Blinded by his own arrogance and the desperate need to secure his throne, Cronus swallowed the rock whole. He felt the weight settle in his gut, believing his legacy was finally safe, unaware that he had consumed the instrument of his own undoing while the true king was being spirited away. While the king of the Titans sat smugly on his throne, the true heir was screaming his first breaths in the Dictaean cave. Zeus was not raised in the halls of power, but in the wild, rugged heart of nature. He was cared for by the nymphs Adrastea and Ida, who saw in the infant the flicker of a coming dawn. He was nourished by the divine goat Amalthea, whose milk provided the strength of the gods, and whose horn would one day overflow with the bounty of the world. But a crying infant is a beacon of discovery, and Cronus had ears that could hear the whispers of the wind. To hide the child's presence, Rhea enlisted the Curetes, armored warriors who stood guard outside the cavern. Whenever the young god wailed, they struck their bronze spears against their shields, creating a rhythmic, metallic cacophony that masked the sound of a child's vulnerability. Under this constant thunder of clashing metal, Zeus grew into a man of immense power, his heart fueled by the stories of the brothers and sisters he had never known, held captive in the darkness of his father's belly. Zeus did not return to his father as a conqueror at first, but as a shadow.
Guided by the Titaness Metis, the personification of wisdom, he learned that brute force alone would not be enough to dismantle the old guard. He needed a key to unlock the living prison of his father's stomach. Metis prepared a potent emetic, a mixture designed to purge what had been stolen. Disguised as a lowly servant, Zeus infiltrated the court of Cronus, assuming the role of cupbearer. It was a position of intimacy and trust, allowing him to stand inches from the throat that had swallowed his kin. At the height of a great feast, Zeus handed his father a golden goblet laced with the mixture. The reaction was violent and immediate. Cronus doubled over, his divine body convulsing as it rejected the years of theft. First came the stone, the omphalos, which would forever mark the center of the world. Then, one by one, the siblings emerged: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. They did not come out as infants, but as fully formed deities, their spirits unbowed by their long confinement, and their eyes burning with a shared hunger for vengeance. The emergence of the Olympians ignited a conflict that fractured the foundations of existence, the Titanomachy. For 10 years the world was a theater of carnage. The Titans fought from the heights of Mount Othrys, while Zeus and his siblings established their base on the jagged peaks of Olympus. It was a war of attrition, a stalemate between the ancient strength of the earth and the rising fire of the heavens. Realizing that the current balance would never break through sheer force, Zeus descended into the lightless pits of Tartarus. There he broke the chains of the forgotten prisoners of the previous age. He freed the Cyclopes, masters of the forge, who in gratitude crafted for him the weapon that would define his reign, the thunderbolt. Beside them stood the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, giants of incomprehensible scale. When they joined the fray, the sky itself seemed to collapse. The Hecatonchires rained down mountains of stone, 300 rocks at a time, while Zeus stood at the precipice of Olympus, hurling bolts of white-hot lightning that turned the battlefield into a sea of fire. The old world could not withstand such a concentrated assault of ancient power and new fury. The Titans broke, their golden age crumbling into the dust of the newly formed mountains, leaving the throne of the universe vacant for the one who had survived the dark. The silence that followed the fall of the Titans was heavier than the war itself. The screams of the giants had been replaced by a chilling stillness, and for the first time in an eon, the winds of the world blew without the weight of Cronus's cruelty. But victory is a heavy burden. The 3 sons of Rhea, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, stood amidst the wreckage of a broken universe, faced with the terrifying task of building something new. They were not creators in the sense of making something from nothing. They were inheritors of a scorched earth, political victors who had to figure out how to share a singular throne without turning their weapons on one another. To prevent another cycle of father killing son or brother fighting brother, they turned to the most impartial judge they could find, the luck of the draw. It is a common mistake to view Zeus as an omnipotent deity who fashioned the stars and the seas with a wave of his hand. In truth, he was a survivor of a brutal civil war, a general who had led a successful coup. The universe was not his by divine right of creation, but by the right of conquest. To stabilize this new order, the brothers gathered to shake the lots within a helmet. This was the moment of the Great Division. They agreed that the world would be split into 3 distinct provinces, each governed by one brother, while the earth and the great mountain of Olympus would remain common ground, a neutral territory where their interests would inevitably collide. Hades, the eldest and perhaps the most somber of the three, drew the lot of the murky darkness. His was the world beneath the soil, the hidden places where the roots of the mountains took hold and where the sun could never reach. It was a cold, silent territory of mineral wealth and the eventual residence of every mortal soul. Poseidon drew the lot of the gray sea. His was a world of shifting tides, immense pressure, and the vast, salt-heavy blue that wrapped around the continents like a shroud. He became the master of the deep, the shaker of the earth, ruling over the monsters of the abyss and the storms that battered the coastlines. Then there was Zeus. He drew the lot of the wide sky. At first glance, it might have seemed the least tangible of the three. It had no solid floor like the underworld and no crushing weight like the ocean, but the sky was the ultimate vantage point. By claiming the heavens, Zeus positioned himself above his brothers in more than just name. From the heights, he could see every corner of the world. He controlled the light that allowed life to flourish and the storms that could destroy it. The sky was the domain of the eagle and the lightning bolt, the place where the sun traveled and where the clouds gathered to judge the earth below. By winning the sky, Zeus had secured the high ground of the universe, transforming himself from a mere brother into the supreme administrator of the cosmos. This division established the celestial hierarchy that would govern the Greek world for millennia. But a king needs a palace, and a palace needs a foundation. They chose the highest point in their known world, Mount Olympus. This was not a metaphorical location or a distant star. It was a physical reality, a jagged, snow-capped mass of rock in the north of Greece that pierced the clouds and seemed to touch the very fabric of the heavens. It was here that Zeus established his court. The geography of Olympus was designed to reflect the new order. At the base of the mountain, the world of mortals continued its slow, painful crawl towards civilization. In the middle slopes, the air grew thin and the forests gave way to sheer stone. But at the summit, hidden by a permanent veil of mist and light, stood the halls of the gods. Zeus did not rule alone. He was the head of a divine household, a political body that required constant management. The palaces on Olympus were built by Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, using the very bones of the mountain. These structures were not just homes, they were monuments to the fact that the age of chaos was over. There were golden floors that rang with the footsteps of the immortals, and high-backed thrones where the new elite would sit to debate the fate of the world. This was the establishment of the celestial bureaucracy. Zeus was the chairman, the ultimate arbiter who sat at the head of the table, ensuring that the fragile peace between his brothers and the various minor deities remained intact. However, the earth itself remained a complicated problem. Gaia, the personification of the earth, was the grandmother of the brothers, and she was far too ancient and powerful to be owned by any one of them. Therefore, the ground beneath the feet of men became a neutral zone. It was the stage where the gods played out their dramas. Because no single brother had jurisdiction over the land, it became the site of their endless interference. When Poseidon struck the earth with his trident to create a spring, or when Hades reached up to pull a victim into the dark, or when Zeus hurled a bolt to punish a city, they were all operating in this shared space. This neutrality is why the Greek world was so vibrant and terrifying. It was the only place where the three masters of the cosmos could interact. The establishment of this hierarchy transformed the universe from a wild, Titan-ruled wilderness into a structured, if volatile, state. Zeus understood that his power relied on the perception of order. He was the first god to truly understand the power of law and the necessity of boundaries. By assigning Hades to the depths and Poseidon to the waves, he ensured they were occupied with their own vast responsibilities, leaving him free to oversee the grand design from his seat on the clouds. He was the eye of the storm, the central pillar around which the rest of reality rotated. As the sun rose over the newly finished columns of the Olympian palaces, the world finally had a shape. The three brothers had moved from the darkness of their father's stomach to the heights of universal governance. The lottery had been cast, the boundaries had been drawn, and the throne of the sky was occupied. But as Zeus looked down from his golden chair at the winding rivers and the smoke of the first mortal fires, he knew that holding power was far more difficult than seizing it. The Titans were gone, but the spirit of rebellion was a part of the world's DNA, and the king of Olympus would have to spend the rest of eternity proving he was worthy of the lot he had drawn.
The victory over the Titans had been a triumph of steel and strategy, but as the dust settled over the scorched plains of Thessaly, the youngest son of Cronus realized that winning a war was a fleeting glory compared to the crushing weight of a crown. The throne of Olympus was not a prize to be enjoyed in quiet repose, it was a target. The vacuum left by the old world order was filled almost instantly by the resentment of the earth itself. Gaia, the primordial mother, had initially supported Zeus in his rebellion, but she found his new regime just as restrictive as the one that preceded it. In her fury at the imprisonment of her Titan children, she brought forth a final, desperate horror to challenge the new king's right to rule. This was Typhon, the personification of catastrophe. Typhon was unlike anything the gods had ever encountered. He was a creature that defied the laws of nature and biology, a mountain of scales and fire that stood so tall his head brushed the stars. From his shoulders grew 100 snake heads, each one screaming with the voices of lions, bulls, and dying gods. When he moved, the air grew thick with the smell of sulfur, and his shadow cast a darkness that seemed to swallow the sun. This was the ultimate test of the new order. As Typhon marched toward Olympus, the gods, those proud, immortal warriors who had just broken the back of the Titan army, felt a sensation they had never known, genuine, bone-chilling terror. In a moment of collective panic, the majority of the Olympian court fled. They descended to the lands of the south, hiding in the lush valleys of Egypt and disguising themselves as animals to escape the monster's gaze. Apollo became a crow, Artemis a cat, and Dionysus a goat. It was a humiliating retreat that stripped away the veneer of divine invincibility. Only Zeus, and in some accounts his daughter Athena, remained to face the storm. For Zeus, this was the moment of truth. He stood alone on the heights of the mountain, clutching the thunderbolts that had been forged in the fires of the Cyclopes, watching as the horizon was consumed by the approach of the father of monsters. The battle that followed was not a choreographed duel. It was a collision of cosmic forces. Zeus struck from above, raining down white-hot bolts of lightning that cracked the very sky, while Typhon hurled massive boulders and entire mountain peaks at the heavens. The earth groaned under the weight of their struggle. In the first phase of the conflict, the king of gods nearly lost everything.
Typhon managed to wrap his massive serpentine coils around Zeus, pinning the god of the sky and using a jagged blade to cut the sinews from his hands and feet. The ruler of the universe was rendered a broken, helpless prisoner, dragged into a cave where he was left to rot, while the monster celebrated his impending dominion. This period of the myth represents the ultimate vulnerability of order. It suggests that even the highest authority can be dismantled, and that the world is always one step away from returning to a state of chaotic madness. However, the consolidation of power often requires the loyalty of others. It was Hermes, the messenger, and Pan, the god of the wilds, who managed to sneak into the cave and recover the stolen sinews. They restored Zeus's strength through guile and speed, proving that a king's power is often maintained by the specialized talents of his subjects.
Reinvigorated and fueled by a cold, divine rage, Zeus mounted his winged chariot and pursued Typhon across the world. The second round of their war was a pursuit of total destruction. They fought across the mountains of Thrace, where the blood of the monster stained the peaks red, giving them their name. Finally, as Typhon retreated toward the sea, Zeus gathered the full extent of his celestial power. He lifted the massive weight of Mount Etna and hurled it with all his might, pinning the giant beneath the island of Sicily. The victory was final, but the cost was etched into the landscape. Even now, the ancients believed the eruptions of the volcano were the muffled roars of the trapped monster, a reminder that chaos is never truly destroyed, only suppressed. With Typhon defeated, Gaia made one last attempt to overthrow the Olympians by inciting the giants, a race of colossal warriors born from the blood of the sky. This conflict, the Gigantomachy, forced Zeus to evolve further as a leader. He learned that some threats required a bridge between the divine and the mortal. A prophecy stated that the giants could only be killed with the help of a human, leading Zeus to father Heracles. This war wasn't just about survival. It was about the integration of the mortal world into the divine hierarchy. By coordinating the gods and a mortal hero, Zeus proved he could manage complex systems of power, moving beyond the role of a mere warrior general. The transition from a conqueror to a king was now nearly complete. Zeus began to realize that a throne held only by lightning would eventually fall. To truly consolidate his power, he had to become the architect of a new reality. He didn't just rule through fear. He began to organize the universe into a structured, predictable system. He partitioned the domains of the world, granting Poseidon the seas and Hades the underworld, creating a balance of power that prevented any single deity from becoming too ambitious. He established the laws of hospitality, the sanctity of oaths, and the boundaries of justice. This era of consolidation was defined by the realization that the king of gods must be the ultimate arbiter. He was no longer just the strongest god, he was the source of the law. Every challenge he faced, from the scales of Typhon to the spears of the giants, served to harden his resolve and refine his methods. He understood now that his reign would be a perpetual act of maintenance. The chaotic forces of the old world were still there, simmering beneath the earth and at the edges of the map, but Zeus had built a fortress of order that could withstand the pressure. He had moved from the blood-soaked dirt of the battlefield to the high, cold clarity of the throne,
ready to govern a world that he had finally, definitively claimed as his own.
Victory is a transient thing, a flickering flame that requires constant fueling if it is to survive the cold winds of time. Zeus stood atop the world, but the air at the summit was thin and full of whispers that he knew all too well. He understood the dark pattern of his bloodline better than any philosopher ever could. His grandfather, Ouranos, had been castrated and cast down by his son, Kronos. Kronos, in turn, had been vomited out and dethroned by Zeus himself. The logic of the universe suggested that the seat of the king of the gods was merely a temporary resting place, a throne of borrowed time, until a stronger son arrived to claim it. This chilling realization transformed Zeus. He recognized that to break the cycle of patricity, he could not simply rely on his thunderbolts. He had to move beyond the raw power of the soldier and embrace the calculated maneuvers of the sovereign. He needed to be more than a conqueror. He needed to be the source of wisdom itself. His first and perhaps most significant move in this new era of governance was his union with Metis. She was a figure of profound cunning and deep insight, the very personification of the quality the Greeks called metis, the kind of wisdom that is both practical and prophetic. It was Metis who had provided the potion that forced Kronos to disgorge Zeus's brothers and sisters, and it was her counsel that had guided him through the darkest days of the war. However, Metis carried a secret that threatened the stability of the new regime. A prophecy from the ancient earth warned that she would bear 2 children. First, a daughter of immense spirit and courage, and second, a son of such formidable power that he would eventually eclipse his father and seize the heavens. Zeus, haunted by the ghost of his father's failures, refused to play the victim to destiny. He would not wait for the child to be born, and he would not repeat his father's mistake of merely imprisoning his offspring. Instead, he chose a path of total integration. He engaged Metis in a game of wits, eventually tricking her into changing her shape into something small, a fly or a drop of water. In that moment of vulnerability, Zeus swallowed her whole. This act was a pivotal moment in the evolution of his character. By consuming Metis, he didn't just destroy a threat, he absorbed her essence. He literally took wisdom into his own body, ensuring that the cunning and foresight that had once been an external counsel were now part of his own biological and spiritual makeup. He ceased to be a god who merely reacted to the world, and became a god who perceived the underlying currents of reality from within. But wisdom is not easily digested, especially when it is destined to be born. Soon after, a localized agony began to throb behind Zeus's eyes. It was a pressure no medicine could soothe and no rest could alleviate. The king of the gods found himself brought to his knees by a migraine that felt like a mountain cracking open. In desperation, he summoned Hephaestus and ordered the smith god to split his skull open with a double-headed axe. From that jagged wound leapt Athena, fully grown, clad in shimmering golden armor, and letting out a war cry that caused the sun to pause in its tracks. She was the daughter of his mind, a paradox of wisdom and steel. Because she was born from him alone, and because she was female in a patriarchal cosmic order, she represented no threat to his throne. Instead, she became his most loyal agent, the manifestation of his own strategic intellect patrolling the world.
With his mind secured, Zeus turned his attention to the legal structure of the universe. He sought out Themis, the personification of divine law and ancient custom. You cannot run a world on chaos and whim. You need a framework that even the gods must respect. Through their union, Zeus fathered the seasons, the hours, and most importantly, the fates. This was a masterstroke of political theater and cosmic reality. By becoming the father of the fates, Zeus positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of destiny. He replaced the raw, unpredictable terror of the Titans with a predictable, orderly system. Life now had a schedule, and even death had a script. Under the influence of Themis, the universe began to function like a grand machine of justice rather than a theater of war. Yet a king's court is incomplete without a queen who can match his stature and provide the legitimacy of a permanent dynasty. This led to his third and most enduring union, the marriage to his sister, Hera. This was not a soft romance or a tale of simple affection. It was a titanic collision of egos and a calculated political merger. Hera was a goddess of immense dignity and power, a figure who commanded the sky in her own right. By marrying Hera, Zeus didn't just find a partner, he neutralized a potential rival and solidified his claim over the heights of Olympus. Their marriage became the bedrock of the Olympian hierarchy, but it was a bedrock that was constantly being cracked by tremors of resentment. The relationship between Zeus and Hera serves as the ultimate archetype of the dysfunctional aristocratic family. In the golden halls of the mountain, their arguments were not whispers, they were thunderstorms that shook the foundations of the earth. Zeus was the king who could not be contained, a figure of restless energy and constant wandering desires. Hera was the queen who demanded order and fidelity, enforcing her status through calculated cruelty against those who threatened the purity of her house. Their friction reflected the reality of the human world they were meant to oversee. The Greeks looked at the sky and didn't see a perfect, serene paradise. They saw a reflection of their own royal courts, full of jealousy, power struggles, and the constant tension between the desires of the individual and the needs of the state. This family dynamic was not a flaw in the system, it was the system itself. Zeus had built a court that functioned as a microcosm of human society. Through Metis, he gained the intellect to foresee the future. Through Themis, he gained the law to govern the present. And through Hera, he gained the prestige and the necessary conflict to keep the gears of the world turning. The king of Olympus was no longer just a warrior who had climbed a mountain. He was the center of a complex web of relationships that defined every aspect of existence. Every storm, every legal decree, and every flicker of human intuition could be traced back to this chaotic, brilliant family at the top of the world. He had mastered the art of governance by making himself inseparable from the very fabric of thought, law, and social order, ensuring that while the gods might bicker, the throne of the sky would remain occupied forever. Yet this absolute order, this cosmic hierarchy established on the peaks of Olympus, held a precarious and often harrowing place for the creatures of the earth. To understand the reign of Zeus, one must first strip away the modern veneer of a benevolent creator. In the contemporary mind, a supreme deity is often viewed as a loving shepherd, a protective father figure whose primary concern is the moral development and welfare of his mortal children. Zeus felt no such kinship. To him, humanity was an afterthought, a byproduct of the transition between the age of the Titans and his own established rule. He did not love us. He merely suffered our existence, viewing the rise of human capability not as a triumph, but as a potential challenge to the divine monopoly on power. The bridge between the divine and the mortal was a Titan who refused to bow, Prometheus. While Zeus sought to solidify his throne by keeping the secrets of the universe locked away, Prometheus saw potential in the shivering, primitive beings living in the shadows of the mountains. The first great clash between the king and the fire-bringer began at Mycone, where a simple ritual sacrifice became a high-stakes contest of wits. Prometheus, acting as a lawyer for the human race, tricked Zeus into accepting the bones and white fat of a slaughtered bull, leaving the nourishing meat for the humans. It was a slight the king of the gods would never forget. It was not merely about the loss of a meal, it was about the audacity of elevating the servant over the master. Zeus saw in this trick the seeds of rebellion. If humans could outwit the gods, they might one day believe they could replace them. In retaliation, Zeus withheld the most precious of divine elements, fire. He intended for mankind to live in a perpetual state of primitive struggle, unable to cook, unable to forge metal, and unable to see in the dark. He wanted humanity to remain a collection of frightened animals, forever looking toward the mountaintop in terror. But when Prometheus smuggled a spark from the heavens in a hollow fennel stalk, he did not just give humans a tool, he gave them the spark of civilization. Fire allowed for industry, for the development of technology, and for the gathering of people into cities. Zeus's reaction was not one of disappointment, but of calculated, cold fury. If humans were to have the fire of the gods, they would also have to endure the suffering that defined the mortal condition. He did not strike the humans down with lightning immediately. Instead, he ordered Hephaestus to fashion a masterpiece of deception. Pandora, the first woman, was crafted as a beautiful evil. She was gifted with every grace, every charm, and every insatiable curiosity by the gods, and she carried with her a jar filled with the very plagues that would ensure humanity could never truly rise above their station. When that jar was opened, the age of ease ended instantly. Labor, disease, old age, and sorrow were woven into the human experience, acting as a permanent anchor to prevent mankind from drifting too close to the divine. Hope remained trapped inside, not as a gift, but as the final cruelty, a reason for humans to keep enduring the suffering Zeus had orchestrated for them. This hostility deepened as the cycles of time turned. According to the poets, the history of man was a slow, agonizing descent through the ages of man.
The Golden Age, a time of plenty and peace under the rule of Cronus, had long since passed. Zeus presided over the Silver Age, where humans were weak and stayed as children for 100 years, and the Bronze Age, where men grew so obsessed with war that they destroyed themselves. Each successive generation became more violent, more arrogant, and less respectful of the divine order Zeus had bled to establish. By the time the Iron Age arrived, the world was filled with cruelty, treachery, and blood. Zeus looked down from his high throne and saw not a garden to be tended, but a rot that needed to be excised. The breaking point came when Zeus walked the earth in disguise to test the virtue of his subjects. He visited the hall of a king named Lycaon, who attempted to prove the visitor was not divine by serving him a soup made from the cooked flesh of a murdered child. It was the ultimate violation of the laws of hospitality that Zeus himself had codified to keep society functional.
For Zeus, this was proof that humanity had become a failed experiment, an unruly infestation that no longer served the glory of Olympus. The king of the sky decided to wipe the slate clean. He would not use his thunderbolts this time. That would be too quick, and perhaps he feared the fires might scorch the earth beyond repair. Instead, he summoned the rains. He commanded his brother Poseidon to let the oceans breach their banks, and told the clouds to empty themselves without ceasing. The great deluge was not an act of purification in the way later cultures would describe it. It was an act of annihilation. The mountains were swallowed, and the cities of the Iron Age vanished beneath a gray, indifferent sea. Only Deucalion and Pyrrha, children of Titans who had remained wise enough to fear the gods and live with humility, were permitted to survive in a small wooden ark. Even their survival was less a sign of Zeus's mercy and more a recognition of their absolute submission. As the waters receded, they were tasked with repopulating the earth by throwing the bones of their mother, the stones of the earth, behind them. These stones became a new race of humans, one born from the cold rock, hardened by the knowledge that their creator was not their advocate. This is the Zeus of the ancient world, a deity who views human progress as a threat and human independence as an insult. He is the guardian of a status quo that keeps the gods on high and the mortals in the dirt. As he looked out over the damp, silent world following the flood, he did not see a new beginning for a beloved race. He saw a second chance to impose an even stricter obedience, ensuring that while humans might possess the stolen fire of Prometheus, they would always remember the weight of the chains and the shadow of the eagle. The relationship between the King of Gods and the race of men was now firmly established, not as a partnership of love, but a cold treaty between the powerful and the powerless.
But even a king needs more than just subjects. He needs agents. If the treaty was cold, the bloodlines Zeus began to weave through the mortal world were calculated to provide the security for a cosmos constantly threatened by its own primitive ancestors. To the casual observer, or perhaps to the frustrated poets of later ages, the movements of Zeus across the mortal landscape looked like nothing more than the unchecked whims of a philanderer. They saw a god who could not contain his appetites, a divine being who routinely risked the stability of his marriage and the dignity of his throne for the sake of a passing fancy. But viewed through the lens of cosmic survival, these unions reveal a far more clinical, almost desperate blueprint. Zeus was not simply indulging in the flesh, he was building a wall. He was engineering a generation of beings who could bridge the gap between the static perfection of the gods and the violent, shifting reality of the earth. The gods, for all their power, were bound by their own nature. They were eternal, unchanging, and in many ways prohibited by the laws of the universe from interfering directly in the messy business of slaying certain primordial horrors. There were ancient things, giants, monsters born of the earth, and remnants of the older, darker ages that were immune to the lightning of the sky. These entities could only be vanquished by a hand that was both divine and mortal, a weapon that could bleed but also command the elements. This was the necessity that drove Zeus down from the heights of Olympus. Take the case of Danae. Locked in a bronze chamber by a father who feared the future, she was meant to be the end of a line. But Zeus did not see a woman to be won. He saw an opportunity to plant a seed that would eventually sever the head of the Medusa. He did not come to her as a man,
but as a shower of gold, an elemental infiltration of a man-made prison. This was not a romantic encounter. It was a bypass of human architecture to ensure that Perseus would be born. Perseus was a tool, a specialized instrument designed to navigate the world of shadows and gorgons, where a god's brilliance would be too clumsy and too bright to succeed. Every step of that journey was anticipated. The golden rain was the first stroke of a long-term strategic plan to clear the world of its most poisonous inhabitants. When we look at his encounter with Europa, the narrative of abduction often overshadows the geopolitical reality of the myth. Zeus appeared as a white bull, gentle and inviting, only to carry her across the sea to Crete. In doing so, he wasn't just claiming a woman, he was transplanting a civilization. From this union came Minos, the lawgiver, the man who would establish the first great naval power of the Mediterranean. Zeus was using his progeny to organize the chaos of human society, turning scattered tribes into structured kingdoms that could offer the gods the organized worship and the stable environment they required to maintain their own dominion. He was laying the foundation stones of the very cities that would one day define the limits of the known world. Then there is the strange, almost disturbing account of Leda and the swan. It is a story often depicted with a soft, artistic grace, yet its implications are heavy with the scent of coming war. From those eggs came Helen and the Dioscuri. Zeus was looking centuries ahead, orchestrating the grand conflicts that would prune the population of heroes once they had outlived their usefulness. He was breeding the catalysts of history. He understood that for the heroic age to reach its zenith, it needed figures of such magnetism and tragedy that they would reshape the map of the world through their own private passions. However, the masterpiece of this divine breeding program was undoubtedly Heracles. The circumstances of his conception were the most elaborate of all. Zeus did not just disguise himself, he assumed the very identity of Alcmene's husband, Amphitryon, and commanded the sun not to rise for 3 days. He stretched a single night into a marathon of creation. This was not the act of a god in the grip of lust, it was a specialized manufacture. Zeus knew what the other gods did not yet fully grasp. The Titanomachy was coming. The giants, the sons of Gaia, were rising to reclaim the world, and a prophecy hung over the heavens like a shroud. The gods would fail unless a mortal fought beside them. Heracles was the answer to that prophecy. He was a creature of immense suffering and immense strength, a being who could endure the labors that would break any other spirit. Every affair leading up to that moment was a refinement of the bloodline, a narrowing of the focus until the ultimate protector of the cosmic order was finally forged. Even the birth of Dionysus, born of the ill-fated Semele, served a political function in the divine court. By fathering a god through a mortal woman, Zeus was integrating the wild, irrational forces of the earth into the Olympian hierarchy. He was creating a bridge for the human psyche to reach the divine through ecstasy and wine, ensuring that the devotion of men was not just based on fear of the thunderbolt, but on a shared experience of the soul. Each of these unions was a calculated risk. Each one drew the ire of Hera, whose own role was to protect the sanctity of the established order. Their conflict was not merely a domestic dispute, it was a clash between two different philosophies of rule. Hera stood for the preservation of the existing divine structure, while Zeus understood that for Olympus to survive, it had to constantly hybridize itself with the world below. He had to be more than a king. He had to be a gardener, grafting his own essence onto the wild stock of humanity to produce a fruit that could withstand the storms of time. As these half-mortal children grew, the world changed. The wilderness was pushed back. The monsters that had haunted the dreams of the first men were hunted into extinction or driven into the deepest pits of the earth. The heroic age was not an accident of history. It was a sustained military campaign conducted through the medium of lineage. Zeus was the architect of an era where the boundary between heaven and earth was blurred by design, ensuring that when the great threats to his throne finally arrived, he would not be standing alone. He would have a vanguard of sons and daughters, heroes who carried the fire of the sky in their veins and the grit of the earth in their bones, ready to defend a kingdom they were never fully allowed to inhabit. This was the true cost of the crown, a legacy built on the strategic dispersal of his own divinity, one bloodline at a time.
But these bloodlines, as noble and potent as they were, eventually became a burden that the earth could no longer carry. Gaia, the ancient mother, began to groan under the weight of millions. The soil was saturated with the pride of demigods, and the air was thick with the clamor of heroes seeking immortal fame through mortal slaughter. Zeus, sitting atop his high throne, listened to the tremors of a world that was simply too full. He realized that the strategic dispersal of his divinity had worked too well. The age of heroes had reached its saturation point, and for the world to survive, it had to be emptied. The Trojan War was not the result of a single stolen kiss or a golden apple. Those were merely the instruments, the small sparks needed to ignite a massive celestial pyre. Scholars and poets look to the opening lines of the Iliad and find a chilling phrase: the will of Zeus was moving toward its fulfillment. This was the grand design, a systematic depopulation of the earth, a way to cull the greatest legends from the gene pool and return the world to the hands of ordinary, quieter men. Zeus was no longer just a father or a king. He had become a cosmic gardener, preparing to prune his own orchard with a jagged iron blade. As the ships gathered at Aulis and the walls of Troy were besieged, Zeus did not descend into the fray with his usual thunderbolts. Instead, he took the position of the ultimate observer. He watched from the heights of Mount Ida, away from the petty bickering of the other gods who had taken sides like children at a game. He saw the suffering, the grit, and the mounting piles of the dead, and for the first time in his long existence, his role as the judge of the universe became a heavy, lonely burden. He was the only one who understood that this horror was necessary for the continuation of the order he had built. In the 10th year of the conflict, the narrative of the war shifts from the dust of the plains to the silence of the divine heights. Here we see the scene of the golden scales. This is perhaps the most profound image of Zeus in all of antiquity. He holds a balance of pure gold, and into each pan he places a portion of death. On one side, the fate of the Trojans, on the other, the fate of the Greeks. He is not deciding who is right or who is wrong. He is not judging their virtue. He is simply measuring the weight of their destinies as ordained by the laws of the universe. When the scale tipped, it wasn't because of Zeus's whim, but because the universe itself demanded a conclusion. He was the instrument of a law even higher than his own power. But the impartiality of a judge is a cold comfort to a father. The war eventually demanded a price that even the king of Olympus found difficult to pay.
Among the thousands dying in the shadow of Troy's walls was Sarpedon, a prince of Lycia and a son of Zeus's own flesh. Sarpedon was everything a hero should be, brave, loyal, and beloved. As the moment approached for Sarpedon to fall at the hands of Patroclus, Zeus looked down and felt the stirrings of a forbidden desire. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to pluck his son from the path of the spear and carry him home to the safety of Lycia. For a moment, the king of the gods considered breaking the very laws of fate he was supposed to uphold. It was Hera who reminded him of the cost. If he saved his son, every other god would demand the right to save theirs. The order of the world would crumble into a chaotic mess of divine favoritism. The laws of fate would mean nothing. Zeus listened to her, and the silence that followed was the heaviest he had ever known. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply bowed his head and let the inevitable happen. As a gesture of his divine grief, he caused a rain of blood to fall upon the battlefield, a crimson mourning for a son he had the power to save, but the duty to lose. This was the moment Zeus truly became the king of the gods, not through his power to destroy, but through his agonizing discipline to refrain. He watched as Sarpedon's life fled his body, and he commanded sleep and death to carry the corpse back to his homeland. It was a small mercy, a quiet concession in a war that offered very little of either. This sorrow transformed Zeus. In the earlier cycles of his life, he was a god of lightning and lust, a figure of raw, unchecked energy. But here, at the peak of the Trojan War, we see a more somber deity. He is the one who weighs the souls of Hector and Achilles, watching as the scale for the Trojan hero sinks toward the underworld. He feels the tragedy of every loss, yet he never moves to stop the clock. The war served its purpose. The great heroes, Achilles, Ajax, Hector, and Paris, all fell. The divine blood that had once been so prevalent in the world was thinned. The giants of the age were buried in the dirt, leaving behind nothing but stories and ruins. By orchestrating this grand tragedy, Zeus successfully closed the door on the heroic era. He ensured that no mortal would ever again have the strength to challenge the gods, and in doing so, he secured his own throne for eternity. But the cost was written in the lines of his face. As the fires of Troy finally died down and the survivors scattered across the sea, Zeus withdrew. The era of direct intervention, of walking among men and fathering legends, was ending. The world was now a place for the small and the numerous. The king of Olympus remained on his throne, but he was now a distant figure, a judge who ruled through the laws of nature and the quiet weight of fate, rather than the direct strike of the bolt. The Trojan War was his masterpiece of destruction, a necessary ending that allowed a new, more stable world to rise from the ashes. He had saved the world from the weight of his own legacy, but he had done so by becoming the architect of its greatest sorrow. Zeus sat in the high places, the golden scales now empty, looking out over a world that was finally terribly quiet. That quiet world was not an empty one. It was a world held in place by the weight of a single watchful eye. When the ancient Greeks looked up at the gathering clouds, they were not merely observing the weather. They were witnessing the mechanics of civilization itself. To live in the shadow of Olympus was to live within a system of terrifying yet necessary constraints. Zeus was the architect of this system, but his role went far beyond the stories of his conquests and his lineage. To the farmer in the field, the merchant on the sea, and the statesman in the assembly, Zeus was the invisible thread that prevented the fabric of human society from tearing. This brings us to the first pillar of the thunder god's influence, the concept of xenia, or guest friendship. In a world where travel was a brush with death, where a man leaving his village became a nameless ghost with no legal standing, xenia was the only thing that offered safety. Zeus was worshipped as Zeus Xenios, the patron of the stranger. To the Greeks, every traveler might be the god in disguise, testing the limits of human compassion. If a man knocked on your door, you did not ask his name or his business until he had been fed, bathed, and given a place to sleep. This wasn't merely a social custom, it was a religious law enforced by the highest authority. To turn away a guest or to harm a host was to strike at the heart of Zeus himself. He was the guarantor of the road, the one who turned the hostile world into a network of safe harbors. Without Zeus Xenios, the Greek world would have remained a collection of isolated, paranoid cells. With him, it became a civilization. But the god who guarded the guest was also the god who watched the word. Zeus Horkios, the keeper of oaths, was perhaps the most frightening aspect of his character. In a time before written contracts and complex legal bureaucracies, a man's word was the only currency that mattered. When an oath was sworn, it was usually done with a libation to Zeus, inviting his lightning to strike if the promise was broken. Here we find the great paradox of the Olympian king. History and myth are filled with the broken promises of Zeus. He deceived his wife. He tricked mortals, and he shifted his shape to bypass the very boundaries he supposedly protected. This leads us to a profound cognitive dissonance in Greek thought. How could a god who so frequently broke the rules be the one tasked with enforcing them? The answer lies in the fundamental difference between modern religious concepts of morality and the ancient Greek understanding of power. To the Greeks, Zeus was not a good god in the sense of being a moral role model. He was the sheer, unadulterated reality of the universe. A thunderstorm does not care if it is being fair, it simply is. Zeus was the personification of the sovereignty that keeps the universe from dissolving back into the primal soup of chaos. He was order, not morality. When the Greeks looked at the contradictions of Zeus, they didn't see a failure of theology, they saw the truth of nature. The king must sometimes be a tyrant, the father must sometimes be a judge. They understood that the person who holds the power to create the law must also be the person who sits above it. If Zeus was bound by the same rules as a mortal man, he would no longer be the supreme authority. He would be just another cog in a machine, and a machine without a driver eventually breaks. By existing outside the boundaries of mortal ethics, Zeus provided the fixed point around which the rest of existence could rotate. He was the necessary terror. He was the force that ensured that even if life was unfair, it was at least predictable enough to sustain a culture. This relationship was transactional and based on awe, not a personal connection. The average Greek did not love Zeus as a modern believer might love a deity. They respected his function. They feared his reach. They recognized that without the threat of his thunder, the marketplace would become a den of thieves, and the home would become a place of violence. Zeus Horkios was the shadow behind every handshake. He was the silent witness at every wedding and every treaty. He was the reason a man could travel from the Pillars of Hercules to the shores of the Black Sea and expect that the basic rules of human engagement would remain the same. The weight of this responsibility is what truly defines the philosophy of the thunder god. As he looked out from those high places, Zeus was not merely enjoying the silence of a conquered world. He was maintaining the tension of it. The golden scales were empty because the balance was being held by his hand alone. To be the king of the gods was to be the ultimate arbiter of a world that was constantly trying to slip back into the dark. The Greeks accepted his infidelities and his outbursts as the natural byproduct of his immense, overwhelming vitality. You do not ask the sun to be gentle. You simply accept that its light is the only thing keeping the world alive. In the Greek mind, the presence of Zeus was a reminder that the universe has a structure. It is a harsh structure, one that demands sacrifice and offers no guarantee of individual happiness, but it is a structure nonetheless. He was the barrier between the human city and the howling wilderness of the Titans. He was the reason that the stars moved in their courses and the seasons followed their path. Even his anger served a purpose, acting as the ultimate reset button when human hubris threatened the stability of the whole. As the documentary moves forward into the twilight of the heroes, it is this version of Zeus we must remember. Not just the lightning bringer, but the foundation stone. He was the god of the oath and the god of the guest, the two pillars that allow humans to live together in peace. He was the architect of a world where words had weight and strangers had rights. He may have been a god of many flaws, but to the people who walked the dusty paths of the Peloponnese, he was the only thing standing between them and the return of the abyss. The thunder was not just a threat. It was the sound of the universe's heartbeat, steady and unyielding, reminding everyone below that the king was still on his throne and the order of the world was still secure. But even a heartbeat can falter. For centuries, the thunder was an absolute truth that required no explanation. Yet as the Greek city-states grew and their thinkers looked toward the stars with a different kind of curiosity, the sky began to lose its mystery. The age of myth, where a storm was the direct expression of a god's temper, began to collide with the age of reason. It was not a sudden rebellion, but a quiet, persistent erosion of the old ways. Men like Socrates and Plato began to ask if a god who succumbed to lust, jealousy, and petty anger was truly worthy of the title. They sought a higher form of justice, one that did not rely on the whims of a king who sat atop a mountain, but on the unchangeable laws of logic and morality. The gods were being moved from the peaks of Olympus into the abstract corridors of the human mind, transitioning from living forces of nature into symbols of philosophical thought. When the center of power shifted from the mountains of Greece to the marble hills of Rome, Zeus did not disappear, he evolved. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, looked at the Greek pantheon and saw a framework they could use to govern a burgeoning empire. Zeus was renamed Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the best and greatest. In this new form, he was less the wandering, passionate lightning bringer of the old poems and more a stable pillar of the state. He became the guarantor of oaths, the divine protector of the Roman Senate, and the ultimate symbol of imperial authority. Under the shadow of the Roman eagle, the god was institutionalized. His thunder was no longer a wild outburst, but the sound of Roman law ringing out across the Mediterranean. Jupiter was the cosmic reflection of the emperor himself, a figure of order, meant to keep the sprawling provinces in check. But even this grander, more structured version of the king could not halt the changing tides of the human spirit. The world was becoming smaller, more connected, and increasingly skeptical of the ancient giants. During the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, a strange story began to circulate among sailors and scholars alike. It was said that a ship passing the island of Paxi heard a voice crying out from the darkness of the shore, calling for a man named Thamus. The voice commanded him that when he reached the shore of Palodes, he must announce to the world that the great god Pan was dead. When the news was finally shared, a great groan of lamentation rose from the earth itself. While the story focused on the god of the wild, its implications were far wider. It signaled the end of the ancient world's magic. The silence that followed was the sound of the ancient gods withdrawing from the physical world. Zeus was no longer seen in the lightning. He was becoming a memory, a literary figure, a statue in a courtyard that people walked past without trembling. As the centuries turned and a new faith began to rise from the edges of the empire, the king of the gods faced his final transformation. The temples were eventually closed and the altars went cold, but Zeus was too deeply woven into the human psyche to be completely erased. The early church, looking for a way to depict the majesty of their own deity, reached back into the visual language of the past. They did not look to the humble figures of the desert, but to the marble masterpieces of the classical world. The long, flowing beard, the high, furrowed brow, and the regal posture of Zeus seated on his throne were adopted as the standard image for the Christian god. The iconography of power survived the gods themselves. Even today, when we picture a divine father looking down from the heavens, we are often seeing the ghost of the thunderer. The lightning may have faded into the background of science, but the silhouette of the king remains etched into the way we perceive the sacred, a lingering echo of the heartbeat that once commanded the universe. That echo doesn't just vibrate in the halls of history. It thrums in the very language of our modern existence. We no longer climb Mount Olympus to offer burnt sacrifices, but we still look upward with a sense of smallness, seeking the face of the one who governs the vastness. If you want to find the king today, you only need to look at the night sky. There, hanging in the dark, is the largest planet in our solar system, bearing the name his Roman counterparts gave him, Jupiter. It is a fitting vessel for his spirit. Just as Zeus was the protector of the hearth and the shepherd of the gods, this gas giant acts as a cosmic shield, its massive gravity pulling in wayward asteroids and debris that might otherwise threaten our world. Even in the cold precision of modern astrophysics, the role of the protector remains, a celestial version of the god who kept the cosmos in balance. But the king has also descended from the heavens to inhabit the stories we tell ourselves for entertainment. He has become a shapeshifter once again, moving through our cinema and our digital screens with ease. In one breath, he is the booming, jovial father figure of animation, a golden-haired patriarch defined by thunderous laughter and a soft spot for his heroic son. In the next, he is the cold, distant antagonist of a video game, a symbol of the old guard that must be toppled by a new generation of heroes. We see his influence in every caped figure who descends from the sky to bring justice, and in every leader who struggles with the heavy burden of absolute power. He has transitioned from a literal entity to a narrative blueprint. He is the archetype of the King Father, the source of both life and law, the provider who can just as easily become the tyrant if his authority is questioned. Why does this specific image endure when so many other deities have been lost to the dust? Perhaps it is because Zeus represents something fundamental about the human psyche. We have an inherent, almost desperate need to believe that the world is governed by a will rather than just by random chance. When the sky turns black and the wind begins to howl, the ancient parts of our brain still look for a face in the clouds. We want there to be a reason for the storm. By giving the thunder a name and a personality, the Greeks made the terrifying unpredictability of nature feel almost intimate. They turned a cold atmospheric pressure into a fatherly anger we could understand, negotiate with, or even respect. We see ourselves in his flaws, his pride, his passion, and his fierce protection of his own. Today, the marble columns of his great temples are broken and bleached white by the Mediterranean sun. The altars are cold, and the prayers have long since fallen silent. Yet his presence is far from gone. Every time we grapple with the complexities of leadership, every time we look at the stars in wonder, and every time the sky cracks open with a sudden brilliant flash of light, we are acknowledging his domain. We have moved beyond the myths, but we have not moved beyond the feelings that created them. The lightning doesn't need a god to strike, but the human heart still needs the myth to explain why the world feels so alive. As long as the thunder roars, the King of Olympus lives on, reminding us that even in an age of reason, we are still children, staring up at the clouds, waiting for the king to speak.